The man accused of gunning down UnitedHealthcare CEO Thompson last December has caught the attention of the Trump administration, and if convicted, it could mean a death sentence. Attorney General Pam Bondi directed prosecutors Tuesday morning to seek the death penalty in the case against Luigi Mangione. The Hill's courts and legal reporter Zach Schonfeld joins us now with the latest. Hey Zach, thanks for joining us. This case has received some national attention. Mangione even has a following that's raised a substantial amount of money for his legal defense. But for all the attention, the case was pretty much proceeding as normal. Now the Attorney General steps in. What did she say in her announcement, and why is she getting involved here?
Hey, Drew, this announcement by the Attorney General goes back to a day one policy shift by the Trump administration. Back during the Biden administration, there was a moratorium on federal executions. Biden, in one of his final days in office, he actually went as far to commute 37 of the 40 people on federal death row. But that very quickly changed once Trump came into office. He directed his Justice Department to again begin pursuing the death penalty in appropriate cases. And you're now seeing that play out in a real life example here in the case of Luigi Mangione. And that's this whole conversation around the death penalty is why the fact that he's facing not only a case in New York State court, but he's also facing this federal case is so important, because at the state level in New York, there is no death penalty. So it's only this federal case on one of these 4 federal charges. If he down the road is convicted by a jury, it would make him eligible for the death penalty. But meanwhile, we did just hear from Mangione's attorney in a statement. She called this move barbaric.
Shifting gears, up on Capitol Hill, the House Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on judicial overreach. It's been a focus of Republicans after several court decisions blocked President Trump's executive actions. Here's House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier today.
There really is a constitutional crisis that's developing. It's not the one that the Democrats claim, though. You have activist judges who are abusing the system to legislate from the bench. That's effectively what an activist judge is. This is not how the system our founders designed is supposed to work. Under our Constitution, we have 3 co-equal branches of government, each with the ability to provide a check on the other. And we do have that authority.
Okay, constitutional crisis, says Speaker Johnson. What are Republicans going to do about it?
We've seen a lot of noise on the impeachment front, but at this hearing today, you even saw some Republicans acknowledging that impeachment doesn't have realistic chances of succeeding. You heard that from none other than one of the witnesses today, former Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who of course knows a thing or two about impeachment given his involvement in Bill Clinton's impeachment. But even he today said that these calls for impeachment aren't realistic in his view. So instead, Republicans have been going to other options. Congress does have a lot of authority over how the lower courts are structured. And we actually heard today from House Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan. He laid out what he called a 3-pronged approach for Republicans. He said the first prong is legislation, these bills that propose restricting judges' authority to issue these nationwide injunctions. He said the second prong is oversight. And the third prong, he said, is considering exploring defunding aspects of the federal judiciary. So even if impeachments don't work out, seems like Republicans are exploring a lot of other options here.
And speaking of judges blocking Trump's agenda, a judge recently blocked the president's bid to end temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan immigrants. Walk us through that ruling.
Yeah, this is a ruling that comes out of San Francisco from an Obama-appointed federal district judge there, blocking the Trump administration and Kristi Noem and the Department of Homeland Security's decision to rescind what is known as temporary protected status, or TPS for short, for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan migrants. This status protects those migrants from being deported out of the country. The judge here ruled that the administration was likely in part acting here based on racial animus. He also said the administration hadn't followed the right procedures in rescinding that status. So this is only an initial ruling in the case. It's not a final decision, but still a major loss here for the Trump administration.
And how big of an impact is this going to have on Trump's deportation efforts? I know some of these TPS protections were set to expire as sought by the Trump administration this month.
Yeah, this is really only one piece of the broader puzzle right now of this complicated legal battle over the Trump administration's sweeping shifts in immigration policy. So, for example, this case is a bit of a different bucket from the administration invoking the Alien Enemies Act in the last few weeks to try to swiftly deport migrants to that El Salvadoran prison. But it certainly does have a big and profound impact for these hundreds of thousands of migrants here who have this status.
Meantime, the White House is admitting that one of the deportees sent last month to a notorious mega prison in El Salvador was in the U.S. legally and had protected legal status. The government says Kilmar Abrego Garcia was deported due to an administrative error, but that they have no jurisdiction to bring him back. What do we know about this case in particular?
Yeah, Drew, this is seemingly the first time that the Trump administration in one of these deportation lawsuits has acknowledged that they got it wrong. There was a ruling from an immigration judge a few years ago granting this individual protections that prevented any administration from deporting him to El Salvador as he was raising concerns that he would be tortured, things of that nature. This is a lawsuit that has been filed by his family. They say they saw him on the video footage that has been, making waves of these migrants at this El Salvadoran notorious prison. And they are contesting, any notion that he has ties to any gangs. The Trump administration, even though they said there was an error, they did bring up in court filings the fact that ICE a few years ago had said that a confidential informant had indicated that this individual was a member of MS-13, but his family is contesting that right now in court.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Zach Schonfeld, the Hill's Courts and Legal Reporter. Head over to thehill.com and sign up for Zach's weekly legal newsletter, The Gavel. Voters in Wisconsin and Florida are heading back to the polls today in the first major election since Donald Trump and the Republicans swept back into power last November. On the ballot in Florida, 2 House seats, both won handedly by Republicans in November, both vacated by Trump appointees, former Attorney General Matt Gaetz and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. In Wisconsin, voters will fill a seat on the state Supreme Court and decide its ideological direction for years. The Hill's national political reporter, Julia Manchester, has been following both of these races closely and joins us now. Julia, thanks so much for being here. Let's start in Wisconsin. This race is nonpartisan, but lots of partisan money is flowing in, nearly $100 million so far. Why is so much money being spent on this race? And who's spending it also?
So ultimately, this comes down to congressional redistricting, because we know that if liberals control the Wisconsin Supreme Court or if conservatives control the Supreme Court, it will come down to them essentially redrawing those maps to, favor a partisan cause, essentially. So you saw Elon Musk, one of those people who is spending quite a bit of money in this race, talking about why this is such a high stakes race going forward. You also have a lot of Democratic groups spending, a lot of money in this race. So normally, a state Supreme Court race, we wouldn't really be paying as much attention to it, but because they can draw congressional boundaries, and this would, could impact the control of the House and the on Capitol Hill, this is something we're watching closely.
Also kind of an interesting power struggle between billionaires. You have Musk on one side, J.B. Pritzker and George Soros on the other. Just kind of a gauge of the influence of money on our elections.
Definitely. And look, depending on who wins, there's going to be, that question with the outcome. Okay, how much does money ultimately play in politics? It's interesting. A lot of Republicans have actually downplayed this race to me in recent days, essentially saying that Democrats are favored to win this race. If Democrats lose this race, that's on them. So there's going to be, I think, a lot of hand-wringing on both sides depending on what's happened. But polls show a tight race. I would say, though, conventional wisdom tells us that Democrats are somewhat favored to win.
Let's shift gears to Florida. There are these 2 deep red seats, one in the Panhandle, other on the East Coast, Daytona up north from there. Democrats have far outraised Republicans in these races. Democrats have been kind of lost since their 2024 election losses. They're using this money to get their message out. What have you seen as far as the messaging, that is being sent out to the world with all this money that they're raising?
So first of all, these two congressional districts are very different. Even though they're both deep red, I would say that the first congressional district along the Panhandle, that is very, very safe Republican. It would be absolutely shocking if a Democrat won that
it's the most
seat.
Republican
Yes, the
seat
most
in the state.
conservative
Yeah.
seat in the state. However, even though the 6th congressional district along the Atlantic coast is still conservative, I think it's slightly more competitive for a number of reasons. Number one, you have more of a diverse socioeconomic community, number of different socioeconomic communities in that district, maybe a little more racially diverse than the 1st congressional district. But also, and we've heard Governor Ron DeSantis even say this, State Senator Randy Fine, who is running on the Republican side in this race, he lives in Brevard County, outside of the district, so in the Central Florida area, but not within the district. And he's also considered a relatively weak candidate. He has the backing of President Trump, but he didn't start spending in this race and start going on air on television in this race until really the middle of March. You had Democrats really pouring resources into this race, going back months ago. So, Democrats, though, I talked to say that this isn't necessarily about, whether they win, but it's about closing those margins, narrowing those margins. They've lowered expectations for themselves too, because this is a tough district. Mike Waltz won it by 30 points. Trump won it by over 30 points. Ron DeSantis used to control this district when he was in Congress. But they essentially say that if they close that gap, if it's a 10-point loss or less, that's in a way a victory for them.
And let's talk a little bit about the stakes here. Like you said, these are Republican districts. The chances of Democrats winning very low. But it would be a monumental shakeup if a Democrat was able to win either of those races, and a huge issue for Mike Johnson in the House.
It would be a political earthquake. And look, you have some Democrats saying, well, it happened in Pennsylvania. They point to that state Senate seat last week that flipped, that Trump had won in November, and they're sort of comparing that to this. I think comparing Pennsylvania and Florida is sort of like comparing apples and oranges. In Florida, Republicans have a 1.2 million voter registration advantage, so it's already a more difficult state for Democrats. But look, a lot of this does have to do with Mike Johnson really keeping the margins as wide as he can in the House of Representatives. Remember, he's trying to pass that big, beautiful reconciliation bill, or two bills, and he knows that there might be some division or might be some naysayers in his conference, so he needs as many Republicans on board with that as possible.
It seems more likely that the margin of Republican victory in these two Florida races will be used as a barometer for other Republicans heading in to the midterm elections. But also, if Democrats ever want to compete in Florida, which, considering the demographic changes of this country, would seem to be something important for Democrats if they ever want to win national elections, reducing the margins that they lose in districts like these two could be hugely important as they try to build some kind of momentum in Florida.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because you saw DNC Chair Ken Martin travel to Florida over the weekend. He not only campaigned in the 6th Congressional District with Democrat Josh Weil, but he also campaigned a little bit in Orlando. Orlando's obviously not having a special election, but we saw President Trump perform very well in that greater Orlando area. He might not have won it outright, but he started to peel away some key constituencies from Democrats, like Puerto Rican voters, for example. So Democrats want to start rebuilding. They don't just want to focus on their traditional strongholds. I think they view Florida as a place for potential opportunity. They just have to rebuild the infrastructure.
Lots of people moving to Florida after the 2030 census that could be picking up even more electoral college seats. So it'll be definitely a focus for both parties moving forward. We'll leave it at that. Julia Manchester, thanks so much.
Drew.
And that is today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.